conectado desde la sala de videoconferencia de la Facultad de Económicas de la UNED con Daniele Ganser, historiador suizo y profesor de la Universidad de Basilea y autor del libro Los ejércitos secretos de la OTAN, la operación Gladio y el terrorismo en Europa occidental. Y por eso le entrevistamos hoy aquí, para saber qué fue la operación Gladio y cómo se desarrolló en nuestro país, ya que el libro contiene un capítulo dedicado al mismo. I'm going to ask you a group of questions. The first are going to be about Gladio in general, and the history and so on. And then I want to talk about Gladio in Spain, about your chapter of Gladio in Spain. So maybe we can talk first about the general things about Gladio in Europe. And so what is Gladio? What's the definition of Gladio? And what are the secret armies of the NATO?
So the word Gladio is actually used as a name for the Italian secret army, which operated in Italy during the Cold War. Gladio was discovered in 1990, first time in Italy, and then Italian members of the secret army said that similar secret armies existed in all countries of Western Europe. The Italian Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti at the time explained that the name Gladio was secret for a long time, nobody knew about it, and it was the name for a stay-behind army, which meant it was a network of soldiers who waited for a Soviet invasion. That was one of the main ideas, and the other thing was that they tried to manipulate the Italian political system in the absence of a Soviet invasion.
I would like to know if it was financed by the CIA and coordinated by NATO. Where did the money came from?
Well, the idea for the network was an American and a British idea. Washington and London at the beginning of the Cold War were scared that in Western Europe communist parties or at sometimes socialist parties would come to power. And in Italy we had very strong communist parties, and in France we also had strong communist parties. And so they set up these networks, and so the money in the beginning came from the CIA, the American Central Intelligence Agency, which is the foreign secret service of the US, and much of the training came from the British, the MI6, the British Foreign Secret Service. So really it was the CIA and the MI6 together working in Italy and instructing the secret soldiers of the Gladio units. The coordination of the stay-behind armies was managed through NATO. So we had a secret branch within NATO, which was called the Allied Clandestine Committee, ACC. And in this ACC, the representatives of the Gladio in Italy, people from the CIA, people from the MI6, but also from all the other NATO countries, thus from Norway or Denmark or France or Germany, they met and sat together to discuss what to do with the secret armies.
So how did the secret soldiers receive orders? There were hierarchical direct orders, or there was freedom of action?
There was a hierarchical structure, because in Italy, for instance, you have the defense ministry, and within the defense ministry you have the military secret service. And within the military secret service there was a sub-branch, which is that Gladio branch. So it was really integrated as a secret element within the military secret service. It was not part of the army. It was part of the military secret service, but in the sense that people who were working in these networks, they were private people. They didn't consider themselves to be working for the state. Some, and that is the delicate thing, were from the extreme right-wing groups like Avanguardia Nazionale or Ordine Nuovo. These people in Italy were fascists convinced that they had to fight communism because they thought the communists are atheists, and they hated the atheists very much. They were devout Catholics, and they didn't want that the communists come into power. So these people were supported by the United States and by Great Britain in order to keep that delicate balance of power in Italy and in other countries in such a way that the left would not gain too much influence.
So you mean that there were two different kind of Gladio soldiers, like two groups of Gladio soldiers, like the ones that were prepared to act in a possible USSR invasion, and others that were terrorist, fascist.
That is the delicate thing, you know. That is really the most complicated question to answer. It is true. All of these secret soldiers say, we just waited for the Soviet invasion. That is not a criminal thing to do. I mean, these people just thought, in case Italy or France or Germany or Switzerland or Greece, in case any of these countries is going to be occupied, okay, then we come into action. We don't do anything if there's no invasion. So that is a first group, that is correct. But then there's another group, and that is also correct, which was more interested to fight the political fight in the country. There is a general, an Italian general, who commanded the Gladio network in the 1970s, and his name is Gerardo Serravalle. And he explains in a book that when the CIA came to the training center, they had a training center on an island off the Italian coast. And the gladiators were trained there. And then when the CIA came, the General Serravalle explained to the CIA, you know, we have arms caches in hidden places, so in case of the Soviet invasion, we're ready and everything. And then he explains that the CIA was not so interested in their preparations for a Soviet invasion. They were much more interested, he says, in what they can do to influence the Italian political system. So in case there were large protest movements, would they could break a protest movement, or would they could carry out destabilization operations. And that is a very delicate thing with the NATO secret armies, because we now know that some members of the Italian right wing, they came forward and they said, yes, this secret network existed, and yes, I knew of it, and I cooperated with it. And I carried out terrorist attacks, which were then blamed on the communists or on the other groups on the left, and this helped to destabilize Italy. Vincenzo Vinciguerra is there the most important source. He then went to jail, but in jail he explained, you know, NATO covered us. We could carry out terrorist attacks in Italy. And then we were flown, some of us, to Spain during the Franco dictatorship. That was a safe haven. And then we were flown to another country. So it's a very delicate thing.
For example, after I will ask you about the Italian fascist terrorists that came to Spain. But for example, Ali Akka, the person that tried to kill John Paul II. I think you, in your book, in your chapter about Turkey, you talk also about his organization. Was he?
Both, yeah.
Can we say that he was also a stay-behind soldier?
In Turkey, we have also a group of people who belong to the Grey Wolves, which was a very nationalist and sometimes militant part of Turkish establishment. And these people, some of them worked in the stay-behind networks. But it is very difficult to say, this person we know for sure was a member of the Turkish secret army, and this person is just a freelance terrorist. I mean, that is very difficult to say, because we don't have the lists of all the people who worked in the secret armies. The military secret services only confirmed, yes, we had secret armies, yes, they were equipped with explosives, yes, they were equipped with weapons, yes, they were trained by the CIA, yes, they were trained by MI6, yes, they were linked to NATO, and NATO was in command. But whenever we try, as historians, to talk to NATO and tell them we need documents, were these people involved in terrorism? When we try to talk to the CIA and say we need more documents, were you linked to acts of terrorism in Europe? I mean, then the CIA said we're not going to comment, and NATO says the same thing, we're not going to comment, because it is still today unspeakable almost to say that there was CIA-linked terrorism in Europe. So it is ongoing research. We know that acts of terrorism were carried out, and we know that many people, including in Turkey and in Italy, who were involved in these acts of terrorism say the Americans and the British covered us. They wanted us to carry out these acts of terrorism, but it's very difficult to prove.
I'm very interested in the economic part of Gladio. I know there is not much information, but for example, in Italy, does it the Gladio network had something to do with the Vatican Bank, the IOR, and the Ambrosiano, and so on, and the money of the mafia?
This I don't know for sure. It is unclear how the money flows were organized. What we do know is that in one case, the Italian secret soldiers, the gladiators in Italy, they said, well, you know, the Americans, they give us the weapons for free. And the British, if we buy the weapons from the British, then we have to pay. And then there was a debate within the defense ministry in Italy whether they should take the weapons from the Americans, from the CIA, or from the British, from the MI6. And then the military professionals said, well, it's actually better to work together with the British because they have a better training. And what they did in the end is that they went to the British, took the training from the British, and at the same time took the weapons from the CIA for free. And in fact, when the British found out, they were very angry because, you know, they wanted to sell their weapons as well. Now, the whole structure of financial flows into Italy during the Cold War is very complicated. Banco Ambrosiano, many other structures, they had black money throwing through their accounts. And whether some of this black money was used to support the secret armies is possible, but we don't know.
Have you studied the links between some Gladio soldiers or people like Licio Gelli or Reinhard Gehlen, the Nazi, with the Order of Malta? Is there? Have you studied that, or is there any more links?
What I looked at is like people like Licio Gelli. I looked at these people in more detail. Licio Gelli was obviously a right-wing extremist in the Italian Cold War, and he was convinced that the Cold War was a war. You know, he didn't consider it to be peacetime. He thought we are at war with the Italian communists. And so he was actually paid a lot of money by the United States to make sure that the influence of the Italian right-wing groups were strong in Italy. And Gelli made this statement that, you know, thanks to Gladio, Italy didn't become a zone of communist influence. So he was proud, and he said, we had a lot of influence behind the scenes. Obviously, in public, people would say Italy is a sovereign country and is a democratic country. But he says that was not true. We were neither democratic nor sovereign because we had a parallel structure, in this case the Propaganda Due, which was a network of people who were from the parliament, who were from the executive, who were leading industrialists, who were bankers, and who also were judges or police officers or military officers. And they all cooperated behind the scenes. And that is not the idea of democratic checks and balances. In a democracy, you actually have the parliament which controls the executive. Okay? And if something goes wrong, you have the judge who says, you know, it's not all right. But in Italy, with the Propaganda Due and with Gladio, we had parallel structures who operated behind the lines. And Licio Gelli was always invited to the United States when the new president came into office, such when in 1981 Ronald Reagan became the new president of the United States. Licio Gelli was there. He was invited because he was an important person from the globe. And the same in Germany. If you look at Reinhard Gehlen, whom you mentioned, he was a general who worked for Hitler during the Second World War. And many people think that at the end of the Second World War, all the generals who worked for Hitler went to the Nuremberg trials. You know, they went directly to jail. And that's not true. Some did, but others were flown to Washington because they were useful. Okay, the Counterintelligence Corps, which is an American secret service, they recruited some of the Nazis and said, now, why don't you run secret operations for us in Germany? You are useful. And Reinhard Gehlen, he was the chief of Fremde Heere Ost. He was then the first commander of the first German secret service, which was called Organisation Gehlen. And that's quite embarrassing, you know, that actually a general from Hitler was the first commander of the first German secret service. But under these circumstances, the stay-behind armies and the secret structures could be set up also in Germany. When I say Germany, I mean obviously the part controlled by Washington and not the part controlled by Moscow.
And do you think they really feared a USSR invasion, or what did they fear the most? The Soviet dictatorship, or that their multinational companies could not have access to cheap labor salaries, for example? I mean, because maybe it was, I think it was an excuse, the USSR invasion, because as you said, they didn't want the communist parties to be in power, but also not just the communist parties, but also the working class movement, I think. Because why did they fear so much the USSR? And by the other way, they were going to China. Nixon was going to China, and China was also a communist dictatorship. So I don't understand that very well.
Well, this is a question which comes up many times for historians. If you look at the Cold War, you can ask, why was the CIA fighting the communists? Why was the MI6 fighting the communists? So what was the problem? And obviously one side of the problem was that people hate the communists. They thought they have totalitarian structures. There was no voting right, for instance, in Romania and Bulgaria. You know, there was just the Communist Party. You could not vote. You could not, you know, meet where you wanted. You had secret services coming and arrest you. Under Stalin, for instance, the Soviet Union was a totalitarian system. So some people in the CIA and some people in MI6, they were especially worried about these things. And that's why they said, we fought for freedom, in the sense of we fought for a good thing. We tried to liberate people from communist oppression. Now that is one story, and it's true. But there is another story, which is also true. In some countries, we had democratically elected presidents, like in Chile, for instance. We had Salvador Allende. He was democratically elected, and he tried, you know, to give more money to the people in Chile and to become more independent of the United States. Now, he was overthrown in 1973 by the CIA, and Pinochet was installed, who was a brutal dictator. So people go like, we thought you fight against dictators. We thought you fight against, you know, the oppression of people. But in this case, you actually installed the dictator. Why did you do that? I mean, it doesn't make sense if it really is true that you fight for freedom. And then you see that the CIA, in some cases, is not interested in fighting for freedom at all, but is interested in securing actually economic privileges. That's what you say, you know, you say, what is it if we think about the money? What is it? Is it actually the money? Why they do all these things, you know, that big companies have bigger profits? And there is obviously a lot of examples. In Guatemala, for instance, you had United Fruit Company, if you want a concrete example of a company, and United Fruit Company, today called Chiquita, they produced bananas and other fruit in Guatemala, and they produced this very cheaply. And the farmers, they were exploited. They belonged to big haciendas, and they had no rights, okay? They had no salary, or just very, very small salary. And then a new government came in, Jacobo Arbenz. And he said, now let's change this economic structure. It is not fair and it is not right. We should give every farmer a bit of land so he can have a little income. You know, just a very little income. He could not get rich. It would just be a little bit for him and his family. But that obviously meant that the big companies would lose their big land, and that was not acceptable. So the CIA came in and they overthrew the government of Guatemala in 1954. Obviously, that was against democracy, but it was for international companies. And now the question comes: how about Europe? Was that the same? It is obviously something which applied also to Europe. Americans and the British were scared that the labor movement would be very strong. and that labor unions, as you had them in France and as you had them in Italy and also in Belgium, would actually dominate the whole economic discourse. In the end, Europe was much more lucky than Latin America because most countries managed to have good salaries for their people, to have social welfare plans. I mean, all these things that we have today in Europe, people fought for them. Voting rights for women, freedom of press, this obviously with limitations, but so it is true what you say, this fight for money is always part of the picture.
Yes, because maybe that's the only information that I would like to have more. Maybe in your next book about Gladio, you can study this, because it can seem strange that the US government was fighting against the Nazis in the Second World War, but after they were hiring some of them, like Klaus Barbie and Scorzeni or Reinhard Gehlen, and they were protecting them and hiring them for their own interests. So this makes me think that we should not think so much in terms of nations, but of oligarchic power of some multinational companies, because as I said before, there's no problem with China right now, and it's a dictatorship. So the problem is not the dictatorship, but the problem is that the thing is that if you can invest or not in that country. If it's a dictatorship, but it lets you have your companies there, and you can have your companies in that country, there's no problem. But if it's a dictatorship that doesn't want those companies to be there, then there is a problem, and then they have to change the government. I don't know if I'm wrong.
No, but this is obviously something which many people are interested in. It's the debate about the free market. Basically, what people say is the free market means everybody can invest everywhere in the world, and the best products will be then generated, and everybody, everywhere in the world, will get richer and will have a better life. That is the theory, okay? But obviously we see that in reality, it very often is the case that some countries are poor, and they have a lot of debts, and they just have to pay interest on their debts all the time. Their people don't have any education, they can't go to school, they can't even read, and they have no chance to get, build a strong middle class. And you just have a very, very small oligarchy, as you called it, and that is the correct term. It just means that you have an upper class of millionaires. For instance, in Angola, if you want. Angola is an interesting country. They have a lot of oil. It's all offshore. But Angola has a millionaire class. These people are very, very rich. They rule the country. They used to be communists, but it doesn't matter. They now became very rich. And the rest of the country is very poor. And what you say is correct, that as long as it's possible to invest in these countries, the government can stay in place. But to take a new example, if you take the Iraq war, which started in 2003, I mean, Saddam Hussein obviously was a dictator, and he was a brutal dictator. He tortured his people, he used weapons of mass destruction. He really used them against his people. Later he didn't have them anymore, but he was an evil dictator. Only, he was supported. He was supported by Washington. He was supported by European governments during the 1980s. Now, in the 90s, they changed their mind. And in 2003, they overthrew him and said, we are now for democracy. Democracy is important. And that is always the story we hear. We always get the story, we only do this for democracy. We don't do it for profit. We do it for democracy. And here in Europe, we just love to believe that because it sounds good and it sounds ethical and it sounds correct. But if you look at the details, you see that now in Iraq, the oil is being, opened up to foreign investments. Like ExxonMobil can invest, Chevron can invest, Statoil can invest, BP can invest, Shell can invest. Also Chinese and Malaysian companies, Petronas, they can invest, and they're actually buying part of that oil. They couldn't do that when Saddam Hussein was still in power. So it is true what you say. We always have to look at the money flow. We have to look, what is the interest of NATO in Europe. And during the Cold War, the interest was, in many ways, also to protect the investments. That is true.
Now I'm going to ask you some questions about Spain, about your chapter of Spain. Maybe we can begin in the Civil War, or if you want to make a brief introduction of Gladio in Spain, I don't know. But maybe I would like to ask you, what's the background for Gladio in Spain after the Civil War?
I mean, the case of Spain was very special, because Spain was a dictatorship under Franco. And in a dictatorship, you don't need to manipulate the elections, or you don't need to, fight the communists. I mean, Franco was making sure that there were no communists in the Italian, in the Spanish government. So that was a completely different situation compared to France or Germany or Italy. The question is, what was then the function of Spain? Were there secret armies in Spain as well during the Franco dictatorship? And there we actually have the same problem. We see, yes, there were secret armies, but then Franco and his system, he had so many different units that he could use for illegal operations. He didn't actually need a secret army. So the interesting thing is actually coming in the 1970s, when Franco dies and Spain enters NATO in 1982. That's when you really look at Spain in this transition from a dictatorship to a democracy. And there it is interesting to see, how does that very young democracy look at that very difficult chapter of the secret armies? And there we just found out that the military secret service, I think it's called CESIT, I'm not sure whether I pronounce it correctly, but the military secret service of Spain, during its time as a democracy, continues to run these secret armies. And when in 1990, the secret armies are being discovered in Italy, Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti, Prime Minister of Italy, says, these secret armies existed also in Spain and in France and in Germany and in Belgium. And the governments in these other countries, they were very, very embarrassed because they didn't want to talk about it. And some people in the Spanish parliament, now that is very good, when you have a democracy, you have people in parliament who ask questions. You didn't have that during the Franco years. But then, in 1990, you have people in the Spanish parliament who ask questions and say, we need more information about these secret armies. The problem was only that Defense Minister Serra at the time in Spain said, no, we're not going to talk about this, and we don't know much about it anyway. And all in all, it was not very strong performance. I mean, the democracy was probably too weak. There's no knowledge about the Spanish secret army in the Spanish parliament.
I was very surprised to read in your book that there was a Gladio base in the Canary Islands, in Maspalomas. What said Alberto Bolo, a secret soldier, about the Las Palmas base?
The Las Palmas base is in that way similar to other bases in Italy, that it was an island. When you have the mainland and you have the islands, it is very easy to have something hidden or secret on an island. I mean, it is the same thing in Italy. They had the Centro Addestramento Guastatori, which was CAG, which was the center of the gladiators in Italy. It was on an island. And in Italy and in other countries, the idea was that these islands could also be used to put political prisoners there. So, they served as a twofold thing, as a training camp for the secret armies. But in case of emergency, we have some sources who say these islands would have been used as prisons.
And what about Scorzeni, the Nazi? He lived in Spain until he died. Was he related to Gladio structures?
It is very hard to say what his exactly role, the role of Scorzeni, but we have different right-wing extremists who just move in these networks. I mean, that was one of the questions that, as a historian, I was very surprised to find that we have so many right-wing extremists in the secret armies of NATO. As you correctly said, at the end of the Second World War, the idea was we have defeated fascism, we have defeated right-wing extremism, And we don't want right-wing extremists in secret armies. Why would we give them explosives and arms and training and fly them around with the help of the Secret Service? You know, that is something which is completely unthinkable. In some countries, like Norway, we had people who were just people from the center. They were not extremists in any way. I mean, I talked to different secret soldiers in Norway, and they were mainly preoccupied that Norway had been occupied so quickly during the Second World War by the Germans, and they said, we need a second option, we need a secret army. Not much understanding for that, you know, that some people said, we want a guerrilla, a secret army, but we don't do any terrorism and we are not right-wing extremists, nothing. I also have talked to people in Switzerland, and most people I looked at, they're not right-wing extremists, but some, that is important, some were right-wing extremists, and Scorzeni was one of them. And these people, they said, we are in a war anyway, so if we carry out a terrorist attack in Europe, that's okay, because we are at war.
There was a Gladio person, Belgian, Andre Moyen. I don't know if you have. Yeah, yes, I cannot pronounce it very well. Who was this man, and what's his role in Spanish Gladio?
You know, it's not very clear the role of André Moyen, but some people say he was working for the Belgian military secret service, and he set up networks also in Spain. And some other people say, oh no, he never worked for the secret service at all. But what I just collected in my book are all these statements that we have about the stay-behind armies in Spain. And what we know from different sources is, yes, there was a secret army in Spain. Yes, it was linked to CIA, MI6 and NATO. And yes, we need more investigation into this. Now, the statements of the people that I mentioned in my chapter on Spain are not the full story. We would actually need much more information, but we only get this information if the Spanish Parliament asks for an investigation. As long as there is no, as long as people don't know that there was a secret army, they will not ask for more details on this point of research.
Could you talk about Gladio in the universities of Spain during the 60s?
Yeah, there is a story that the gladiators were involved in smashing some student movements. It is always a question: why do you need gladiators in a dictatorship? That is a question that always comes back. Franco, he could suppress whatever he wanted. He didn't need secret armies. He had secret services and he had the police. And if you're a dictator, you don't actually need secret armies. But it seems, and that is just what I wanted to put in the book, that right-wing extremists who were active in Italy or who were active in Greece or who were active in France later came to Spain, oppressed the people there, continued in criminal activities, and some of them later went to Bolivia or Chile and continued criminal activities there. So it's more a network, an international network that nobody dares to talk about.
Can you talk more about this Italian fascist that came after the Borghese coup to Spain?
Stefano Delle Chiaie is one of the Italian right-wing extremists. He was involved in operations in Italy and in Latin America and other countries of Europe. And he's one of these persons who knows a lot about the role of the secret services in these operations, and that's why he's never in front of trial. He never stands in front of a judge, because he would say, if you accuse me and if you put me into jail, I'm going to talk about NATO, and I'm going to talk about the CIA, and I'm going to talk about MI6. And these secret services, they were all involved in these operations. So if you blame me, I blame you, and we go down together. That's what he says. And in Italy, we had this Borghese coup, which was almost, basically it was a coup d'etat. But people don't realize that in Italy during the Cold War, we had many attempts to overthrow the government. And at that time, in the 60s, the socialists agreed to withdraw from the government, and at later times they agreed, that is the Aldo Moro affair, not to include the communists in the executive power. So you always had a struggle in Italy on the strength of communists and socialists in the executive branch. That was an intense struggle, and the coup that you mentioned is one of a kind in this struggle power.
What does it mean, quantum? Because they say that it's the name of the Gladio in Spain. Quantum, red quantum.
It is, you know, if you look at the stay-behind armies in all countries of Western Europe, you see that in Switzerland it was called P26, okay? In Italy it was called Gladio. That is, it was discovered in Italy for the first time, so everybody knows the word Gladio. In Greece we have the word red sheepskin. In Spain we have red quantum, a name which surfaced. In Germany, some say it was just called stay behind. So really what you have in Denmark, we have the name Absalon, which surfaced. In Turkey, we had the name counter-guerrilla. So what you really see is that each country had an own history with its secret armies. They had different code names, and it's possible that you have different secret armies in each country. That is possible. It's not to say that everything that happened in Spain was red quantum, and red quantum was controlled by NATO at all times. The problem really is that NATO doesn't want to talk about it. We need a list from NATO which says who was the commanding general in each country for the secret armies. We need this. I mean, people, at least countries who are members of NATO, should have the right to know this. Switzerland, as you know, is not a member of NATO. We are part of the Partnership for Peace, which is called, is a group of countries which just wants to be friends with NATO and have an exchange of information. They don't want to be members of NATO yet, and the Swiss population, they don't want to be in NATO. But I tried to get information from NATO. I sent it to our ambassador in Belgium, and he then handed all my questions to NATO, and NATO just refused to comment. And that is the real problem. You know, the sort of detailed questions that you ask about the name and the network in Spain, they are important. But they need, in order to be answered, they need the cooperation of NATO. And as long as NATO does not publish anything official on the secret armies where they existed, all the names of the people who were involved and the strategic purpose, also the weapons they had and the communication structures they have, we are reliant on the former generals who, you know, before they die, explain what they did in their lives. I mean, that's the data I basically use. General Serravalle explained. He was the general who in Italy operated the Gladio network. He explained how these meetings worked in NATO. NATO never says anything. We just have some people who talk about it, and that's important.
And what kind of terrorist attacks did they commit, and is there any proof that links them to Gladio and NATO? For example, in Montejurra, or the Atocha killing of lawyers? And what links them to Stefano Delle Chiaie and all these Italian fascists here in Spain?
There are unfortunately no proofs. We don't have, you know, a letter from NATO to the Spanish secret army which says, carry out a terrorist attack, please. We don't have that. There is no such proof. NATO can always say, we have nothing to do with it. Mm-hmm. And what we do have is, we have right-wing extremists in Italy who carried out terrorist attacks. For instance, in 1972, there was the terrorist attack in Peteano. And we have Vincenzo Vinciguerra, who actually carried out this terrorist attack. It is interesting to know that the whole network of NATO secret armies was only discovered because this terrorist attack was investigated in more detail. The story for a long time was that the Peteano terrorist attack in Italy, Peteano is just a small village in northern Italy, that this attack had been carried out by the Brigate Rosse, which were the left-wing terrorist group in Italy. Because after the attack there had been a phone call, and it was an anonymous phone call, and they said, we are the Brigate Rosse and we carried out the attack. Okay, fair enough. Everybody believed it, and the police put it out into public. And so the Brigate Rosse were thought to be behind the attack. Later, an investigative journalist in Italy called Vincenzo no, Felice Casson, sorry. Felice Casson, he's a judge, not an investigative journalist, and he investigated this terrorist attack. And he found out that it was completely wrong what they tell, that it was not the Brigate Rosse, but it had been right-wing extremists. So to investigate a terrorist attack can take many, many years until you really find out who was behind it. The attack was in '72, and the investigation of that judge were in the '80s. And in 1990, that's 18 years later, that judge forced the Italian prime minister to publicly say that there's a secret army. Okay, if you look at this, then you understand how difficult it is to investigate acts of terrorism. But in this specific case, Vincenzo Vinciguerra confirmed that he had carried out the terrorist attack. He confirmed that there is a NATO secret army, and the prime minister then had to confirm that there's a Gladio secret army in Italy. But in Italy, we had a lot of debate about the secret armies. In Spain, we had next to no debate. So there's not much knowledge about the details about terrorist attacks in Spain. And that is surprising, because Spain, with the ETA, has its own history of terrorism, and it therefore is sensitive to the question of terrorism. So I don't understand why they're so little interested in NATO secret armies.
I want to ask you also if was Gladio also involved in actions of infiltration in communist and anarchist groups in the countries of Europe, like the Red Brigades, for example, or I don't know if you have information from Spain, but just in Europe in general.
The question of infiltration is an important question, but we don't know for sure whether the Gladio network was involved in infiltration operation. It is possible. We don't have any specific information on that. We know that in Belgium in the 1980s we had a series of terrorist attacks. They were called the Brabant massacres. That was just a very, very strange chain of events where people, you know, in black overalls would walk into supermarkets and just shoot down people, shoppers, you know. They didn't take much money in the supermarkets. They just killed people who were there with their shopping cars, and they just shoot them down. Men, women, children, everybody. And it was terrible. And then the whole population in Belgium was shocked. They were totally shocked. And it seems that the Belgian secret army was involved in this. But when the Belgian Minister of Defense at the time wanted to find out whether the secret army was involved with this, the military secret service refused to cooperate. They refused to hand out the names of the secret army. The Belgian Senate, they made an investigation and said, okay, we need to know who was in these secret armies. We know that the secret armies existed. The Belgian Senate did a very good investigation. They found out that NATO had secret groups, the Allied Clandestine Committee and the Clandestine Planning Committee, and that in these groups the different representatives of the secret armies met. So there's a lot of knowledge which came out of Belgium, but they couldn't find out who was behind the Brabant massacres. And you must understand that in Belgium, these terrorist attacks, that was in the 1980s, the Brabant massacres, that is something which shocked the population. People want to know what happened. It is very important. And it seems that maybe there were infiltration operations there, using other groups and pretending there was somebody else. But still, there's a lot of work to be done. I can't give you a very clear-cut answer on the question of infiltration.
Thank you. And what about Agintpress in Lisbon? Could you talk about that? What was Agintpress?
Well, Agintpress, on the surface, you know, when it says press at the end, you would think that is just a publishing house, you know, Cambridge University Press, okay, that everybody thinks what they do is they publish books. Maybe some newspapers or journals, but in fact, Agintpress was something completely different. It was a front organization we call a name, or it can even be a little shop, which pretends, you know, that actually this is a press house, and in the back of it you have a network which does something completely different. Agintpress was closely linked to the secret armies in Portugal, and the secret armies in Portugal operated also in Spain and in the former colonies of Portugal. So they operated in Africa, and And that is also something, you know, which is obviously a very special thing, because in Portugal you also had a dictatorship under Salazar, and that made Portugal another specific case, like Spain. I mean, Spain and Portugal, and also Greece during the time when it was a dictatorship, they obviously are a specific case for the secret armies.
It's very interesting, this point, because in your book you link Aginter Press to an arms factory in a street of Madrid, Calle Pelayo, in the 1977, and that factory, that flat was rented was rented by Mariano Sánchez Covisa. He was the chief of the Guerrilleros de Cristo Rey, that was a terrorist group that terrorized people in demonstrations, and students' demonstrations, and so on. So I was very interested. When I read that, I was very shocked to see that link, because you say that Aginter Press was linked to the CIA in Lisbon, and then when the dictatorship finished in Portugal, they went to Madrid. And you know, it's very, I think it's a very important point for the investigation in Spain, to follow that link.
I mean, that was the idea of the book, you know, to give many researchers the possibility to start their research based on it. I'm not saying that every sentence in the book must be 100% correct. I'm saying I tried to take together the information that I found, and I hope that in Spain and in Portugal and in other countries, there are people who say, hey, wait a moment, I didn't know about this. This is something which needs to be investigated. And I do see that there are people out there who do this work, and I think that is important. When you take your knowledge and add it to my knowledge, then that is how science works. You know, it's like we have building blocks, and somebody knows this, and he describes it, and somebody takes it and thinks about it and says, "Oh, I have something else. I know this," and you know, you now mentioned something which I didn't know, and that's how knowledge is being built. That is the idea of science. That is the idea of research. The only problem is that this case of research, this sort of research, is very delicate, because we talk about terrorism in Europe, and we don't talk about terrorists, you know, Muslims or just people, you know, far away, and you know, they're all. We always think, you know, they are responsible for everything. We talk about our own terrorism, in sense, you know, the CIA is, if they're linked to terrorism in Europe, that is a serious question that Europe has with the United States. But I know that, for instance, in Germany, it's very difficult to talk about this, because the Germans want to be very good friends with the United States. And the United States are the biggest economic power of the world, also the biggest military power, and everybody does business with them, so nobody wants a problem with their business. And therefore, it's very difficult to talk about CIA terrorism in Europe. I mean, even in Switzerland, it's difficult to talk about it, but I think, you know, we should be courageous, and we should say, okay, we look at the data, we don't jump to conclusions, but we look at all the data. We don't only look in one direction, we look at everything.
Yes, it's very shocking, because if you look at the newspapers of those years, the public opinion must, well, not the public opinion, but in the newspaper you read that, like, if these terrorist groups were uncontrolled, fascist, that they were with no link with political power, with no link with NATO, with no link with anything, just people that want to continue with the Franco regime or something like that, that they are uncontrolled people. You know, like when we read nowadays that a skinhead has beaten someone in the street, you know, but you don't link that with any political power, because that would be very shocking. So I think that's what happened in what happened in Spain those years. But anyway, I'm going to continue with another question. Do you know something about?
I can.
Yes.
I can comment on this. It is true that we don't link political violence and terrorism with the government. We don't do that. I mean, because we think we pay taxes to the government, okay? That is already hard. Okay, we pay taxes, and the government then looks that the schools are good, that the hospitals are good, that we have roads to drive on, etc. We can even, you know, have an army which defends us, and there's security, and we have the police which looks after security. So we understand that the government, in all cases, helps to provide security. Now, the terrorist is exactly the opposite. He does not create security. He creates instability. He creates fear. He creates chaos. We can't really think that the government, to whom we pay taxes and who is for security, has anything to do with the terrorist who creates insecurity and chaos and fear. But in Italy and in other countries, we find that in some specific cases, criminal elements of the government are linked to this strategy of tension. And that strategy is to create fear in the population, to shock people. But then in the end, you pay your taxes to a government which uses the money to finance terrorists. I mean, that is absolutely unacceptable.
And could you talk about the work of these terrorist fascist groups in Spain against ETA? Because you talk about Stefano Delle Chiaie. In your book, we can read that he was also there doing terrorist attacks.
It is true that I've had some information on ETA in my book, but really the research on ETA is much bigger than anything that I covered in my book. Yeah. What is now, there, you know, there are historians in Spain and also journalists in Spain who know much more about it. I frankly don't know much more about it, don't know a lot about it. I have to say this quite frankly. I really specialized in NATO secret armies. And what is now interesting to see is that we need to have these people who know a lot about ETA to look at the data that is now new on the NATO secret armies and see when were they fighting, what was going on, is there a new light that we have to shed on terrorism in Spain during the last 50 years, or does it not change the picture? It's just the question that arises. But really, I would go with the questions concerning ETA. I would go to people in Spain. They know much more.
Yes, because there's a secret soldier, very interesting to study. It's called Jean-Pierre Cherit. He was a member of the OAS. Mm-hmm. And he's in the Montejurra attacks in the 70s. Mm-hmm. He's seen in pictures like Stefano Delle Chiaie and some others. And then he was killed in the 80s because he was doing some work for the Spanish state. And his widow, she asked for the Spanish state for money because she considered that her husband had died for doing a work. State work. So it's very, very shocking. And that's linked to the GAL. I don't know if you've heard about it. It was Grupos Antiterroristas de Liberación. It's
no, I don't know.
Liberation Anti-Terrorist Group. If you read your book, what comes to mind is this must be something related, but I know that there must be some further studies and investigation on all this, because I think your book may change some views about and put some context in all this violence. But it's better that some further studies would be done.
I mean, that is really one of the main interests of my book. I want to open a new way of looking at terrorism, in the sense that we have at sometimes terrorism which is manipulated by state institutions, and that we have in some cases a deliberate idea to spread fear. You know, if you have the idea to spread fear in a society, that can be very, very useful to manipulate the society. And today the topic of terrorism is very big. It's big news all the time. And it is very rare that we can go into the details of the terrorist attacks, because it's very difficult to find out who was behind it, because a terrorist bomb basically destroys most of everything. And you just see people suffering, and it's very hard to find what happened. And then if the state is behind it, then it is even more difficult to find out, because it's the state who carries out the investigation what happened. And the state, as we saw in Italy, cannot accuse itself. It cannot be that, you know, police officers of the state investigate a terrorist attack, And then, you know, they might be honest people, and at the end they find out, oh, Jesus Christ, that's people employed by the state who carried out the attack. They cannot say that. They will lose their job right away. So the state cannot accuse itself. But researchers, historians, journalists, people who are interested in peaceful coexistence, they must, you know, they must research these questions more and more.
And do you know what happened in 1990 in Spain when Andreotti talked about the existence of Gladio in Italy? There was a huge scandal in Europe. And yes, you have mentioned that here in the parliament, some parliamentary ask for information to the president, to the Spanish president, but it seems like nobody saw nothing, knew nothing. Nobody knew about the existence of Gladio, even when we entered in NATO in 1982. So how is this possible? Nobody knows anything. They are lying. What's happening?
When the secret army was discovered in Italy, that was a problematic thing, not only for people in Spain, but also for people in France and in Germany. You know, it was very embarrassing because normally you don't have a secret army in a democracy. That is the whole idea of a democracy. You have an army, but everybody knows who is in that army and where the weapons are, and it's public. You know, it's not something that nobody knows who's in the army and what they do. It's for a democracy a very, very strange thing to have a secret army. The French, for instance, President Mitterrand in 1990 said, you know, we don't have a secret army. And then the Italian Prime Minister, Giulio Andreotti, said, oh, let me check. In this last meeting of the Allied Clandestine Committee, that is that NATO group in which the secret armies met, the French were also there, not only the Italians. So you really have the Italians going down, taking a lot of criticism, and they said, well, the French did it as well, you know, don't attack us. And then the European Parliament said, we need a very thorough investigation into these secret armies, into the question of terrorism in Europe, into who paid this. And they protested towards NATO and said, how could you do this? These were parliamentarians of the European Parliament. And in Spain, you had a parliamentarian who was called Antonio Romero. I think he was from a left party. And he asked Defense Minister Serra, he asked him, you know, what's actually going on? What's happening in Spain? We also have this secret army. Can you tell us more about it? And then Defense Minister Serra said, well, I asked the military secret service, the CESIT, and there the Director General was Alonso Manglano, if I pronounce it correctly, Alonso Manglano. And he just refused to comment. You know, he should have gone in front of Parliament and answered the questions, but he didn't. So as you say, it ends up with nobody knows anything, nothing happened anyway, and forget about it as quickly as you can. I mean, that is really what happened in many countries. In Germany, we had this situation that the SPD, which is the central left party, said, we want a very, very thorough investigation of this. This is like the Ku Klux Klan. That is a quote. That's what they said. This is an illegal right-wing network engaged in criminal activities. We want to know what happened. And then people from the government, CDU, the chancellor was Helmut Kohl at the time, they informed the other party that during their time in office, during their time when the SPD had ruled Germany in the 70s, they had also covered the secret. And if they now wanted to talk about it, then the other political party is going to say what their responsibility was. So everybody was scared to talk about it because everybody was involved.
Let's talk about today. Does Gladio still exist?
I think what is important to understand that manipulated terrorism still exists. We still probably have attacks of terrorism which we don't understand. We get a story and we believe the story, but you know, when we look at history, we find that many acts of terrorism need to be looked at in much more detail. And you know, it can be that Gladio still exists in some countries. I mean, in Turkey, we now have this Ergenekon affair, which is a very big affair. It's about the Turkish military, which planned to carry out terrorist attacks in public places, and then to overthrow the Muslim government of Turkey, now in power. Now the Muslim government, now in power, said this is unacceptable and put the Turkish generals into jail, or in front of court, not into jail, but in front of court. And this is the Ergenekon affair, and it's very closely linked to the Turkish Gladio. So in some countries we still have the question of secret armies. But generally, on a worldwide perspective, we really have the question of manipulated terrorism, whether we are ready to investigate manipulated terrorism, whether we think it's necessary to look at this.
And what happened with all the arms that were the deposits of arms all around Europe?
Well, the military said they cleared the arms caches and took all the arms, and that the arms are now not anymore in private hands of secret soldiers. That's what the military said.
And what does the shape said, the Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers in Europe?
That is NATO's branch in Brussels, the Supreme Headquarters Allied Power Europe, and they said, we don't comment on it. First they said there's no secret army. On the second day they had to correct and say what we said yesterday is not true. We now have to confirm that some things are true, but we can't tell you more because it's national security. And what they then did in secret is that they had all the ambassadors, the NATO ambassadors from every country. You know, every country has an ambassador to NATO. So Spain has an ambassador to NATO, Germany has an ambassador to NATO. And then the Supreme Headquarters Allied Power Europe had to inform these ambassadors because some knew nothing about the secret armies. And then the American general, it's always an American general who is at the top of shape. You know, NATO is always controlled by Americans. And he informed the ambassadors that there were secret armies, but he said they were not linked to terrorism. They were just waiting for the Soviet invasion. So that is actually the storyline that we get. We say, because that is already proven that the secret armies existed and that they were linked to CIA, that they were linked to MI6. That is all proven, and that there were arms caches, that's all proven. So NATO confirmed these things, but they said there's no link to terrorism. And that thing is further research. That is the really delicate and important point, because otherwise we just say, oh, if they say there was no link to research, then that must be true. But before they said there's no secret army, and that was not true. So it's better to look more clearly at these things.
And in your book, you have forgotten to talk about the dirty war against anarchism, not just communism, but anarchism. Why? Because, for example, in Italy, Giuseppe Pinelli was arrested and thrown from a window, accused for being the perpetrator of the Piazza Fontana bombings in 1969. Why is it? Why you have not mentioned anarchism in your book, just communism?
Yeah, it's true. I mean, basically the fight was against everything on the left. I mean, you would group anarchists to the left, and you would, you know, in some cases also socialists were actually targeted. In Germany, we have lists. In Germany in the 1950s, part of the secret German stay behind was discovered. It was called Bund Deutscher Jugend Technischer Dienst, BDJ. And at that time, it was possible to find so-called lists, proscription lists, we call them. That's lists that had been set up by the secret German army. Those were all former people from the Nazi troops, and they had set up lists of people they wanted to kill in case of an emergency. And there are many people from the socialists on these lists. And when they saw these lists, they were scared. They said, you know, it's 1952, that's just, you know, 7 years of the end of the Second World War, and we are already again in this mess. Why do we have right-wing extremists who want to kill other people and have their list? And what you said about 1969, the Piazza Fontana arrest, that was very strange, because the Italian military and the Italian Secret Service at the beginning very, very quickly said that is the political left. Anarchists, socialists, communists, all the same anyway, from the perspective the Secret Service. And they, you know, arrested this one guy, and he died under very unclear circumstances. And they sort of said, you know, he's guilty. And only later, again here, very important to notice, we need a lot of time to research a terrorist attack. Many years later, we find out that this terrorist attack in Piazza Fontana had been carried out by right-wing extremists.
And do you fear for your life because you're publishing this kind of information that shows that how Gladio had been related to terrorism, or?
No, I don't. I mean, you know, you can say that's naive, you should, but the main thing is, in Switzerland, we never had an academic who was killed because of his research. We never had it in the whole history of Switzerland. There was nobody killed ever here in Switzerland because of his research. It's not the same in other countries. You know, if you do research in Colombia on the paramilitaries, you can die. If you do research in Russia on the war in Chechnya, you can die. And in China, you know, if you do research on Tibet and these things, it can be dangerous. It is certainly true that research can be dangerous, but I think that the risks I'm taking are calculable, and I think it's important to think about this research, because if we don't talk about the secret armies, if we don't talk about manipulated terrorism, it is very, very difficult for people who are interested in peaceful coexistence to make any progress, because they will always be paralyzed by fear. And that is the main point. I mean, I'm saying that manipulated terrorism has the idea to create fear in a society. Okay, that is the idea. The people who die in a terrorist attack, they're not actually the target. They die, but the real target is the people who survive and see this, and who are then scared that they could die, and so they don't say anything, they don't do anything, and you know, basically accept whatever they are being presented with. You know, the government can say, we need to search your computers, and people would not accept it, but then after a terrorist attack, they say, okay, search my computer. Or they say, we have, you know, to take you into jail for 7 days, that you don't have even the right to have a lawyer, and that is because there's a big terrorist attack which happened. People, you know, normally would say, no, of course not. That's illegal, you can't do that. But after a terrorist attack, they are scared, and then they sacrifice some of their liberties. And that is not a good idea. It is important to defend democratic rights all the time. Because we've had, you know, too many examples in history of governments who actually abuse their power. I mentioned Chile with Pinochet. I mentioned Stalin in the Soviet Union. You, of course, in Spain, and remember Franco, and in other countries, you know, there's too much abuse of power, too much violence, too much crime, too many lies. And people today communicate over the internet. They communicate in many new ways, and this is gonna have an impact on how they look at things, because they get more stories, not just one story which they read every day in the newspaper, but new stories, and that will start a reflection process. Now, I'm just one person. There are a million people who work on this. I'm just one.
I don't know if we have a little more time, just for a few questions more.
Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah, a little bit. Thank you. Thank you.
10 minutes.
Okay. Anyway, the information that you have in your book is information from newspapers, from books, so it's not confidential or secret information. So for that part, I don't think it's dangerous, because all the information is there, but you just have to read it, analyze it, and study it, and put it together. And that's a lot of work that you did in this book, and I thank you for that. But which documents you would have liked to read, and you have been denied the access to?
I would have liked to read the documents of the Allied Clandestine Committee. I talked about this committee many times in this interview already. It is in NATO that secret unit linked to SHAPE, where the representatives of the different stay-behinds met. You know, sometimes they meet in Brussels, sometimes they meet in Paris, you know, different places that they actually meet, but they always come together and talk about it. Now, we know for sure that the Allied Clandestine Committee existed, because the Belgian Senate, which presented the parliamentary investigation, confirmed that it existed. They had the access to these protocols, and they had access to secret NATO documents. So we know it existed. We also have General Serravalle, who was the general in Italy who commanded the Gladio structures in the 1970s. And he also explains that he was in these ACC meetings, and he talks about them. And we have General Inserilli, who was also an Italian general, who also commanded the Italian Gladio, who talks about the ACC. And the interesting thing about the secret ACC meetings is that you had the Spanish in there, you had the Germans in there, you had the French in there, you had the CIA in there. It's really, this is something outside of democratic checks and balances. No parliamentarian knew about it, you know. It was just, it was hidden behind the wall, and you couldn't see it. And now I'd like to sort of break this wall and access this, the documents of the Allied Clandestine Committee, but I asked, you know, I didn't get the documents. The Swiss government, you know, they were asked whether the Swiss P-26, which was the Swiss state behind, was part of the NATO network. Remember that Switzerland is a neutral country. We shouldn't be part of any NATO network, okay? That is a scandal in Switzerland if that, you know, is confirmed. Now, I think there were links to the NATO networks, and the Swiss government thinks, no, there were no links. We were neutral. That's just the story here. And I don't believe in that story. But anyway, in order to confirm that we were not in the NATO network, but had our own independent secret army somehow, the Swiss defense minister said they had asked the Allied Clandestine Committee records whether the Swiss were ever in these meetings. You know, look at the original transcript. And I said, oh, the Swiss were never in these meetings. I don't know whether that's true or not. I never saw the original documents.
And why do you think that when a person begins to be interested in Gladio operation and the secret armies and looks for information in the internet, all he finds is websites that mix serious information with aliens, UFOs, so a lot of bizarre information, you know, like there's a lot of disinformation on all of this. And in your opinion, what's the reason for this?
I mean, I don't know for sure, but I look at internet sites very critically. You know, some internet sites, really, they mix Gladio and then put aliens next to it. And I say, if I was the Secret Service, I would set up an internet site like this. You know, I would take serious information, very well researched, put it on my homepage, if I was a Secret Service agent, and next to it, I would put aliens, and I would say the world is going to end tomorrow, and you know, just lunatic things, okay? And if you mix these two things, then you actually discredit the information that you put there. Obviously, people don't think that this can be done, but we know, if we look at history, we know that the CIA paid newspapers in the 50s and in the 60s and in the 70s. They paid journalists, okay, many thousand euros, okay, to publish stories that were in their perspective. So that was paid journalists. It was not free and it was not independent, but it was manipulated. Now, well, that was in the old days when you only had newspapers. Now, for 15 years now, we've had the internet. I mean, I first was on the internet in 1997, so that's 13 years now. And these 13 years, it is very clear that also the secret services start to be aware that this is an important source of information. I'm not saying that every bizarre homepage is manipulated by the secret services, but I think some of them are. I mean, why would you actually do these strange homepages, which everybody walks away with a feeling that it's just crap?
And are you surprised of the lack of democratic control of the secret services around the world?
Yes, I'm really surprised. I mean, we should be more critical about this. I'm saying very clearly that some people who work in the secret services are honest people and do a good job. I don't want to say that everybody in the secret services is a criminal and carries out terrorist attacks on their way home before they kiss their kids goodbye and put them to bed. I mean, I'm not saying this. Some people in the secret services actually have the same training like I do. I am a doctor in history. okay? I speak different languages, and I like to read about the world. You know, many people in the CIA, I met some people in the CIA, actually have the same background. You know, they love history, they love politics, they love economics, they know about the world, and so many people are good people, okay? I want to put this very clearly. Also in the Spanish Secret Service, some people are very good and honest people. Also in the Swiss Secret Service, okay? But in some cases, the secret services have been involved in criminal operations, and that is not acceptable. And it's just a question of whether we want to know about this or not. But there's a lot of data. There's such a lot of data on this. Gladio is one example. I talked about Allende in Chile in 1973. It's another example. I talked about Arbenz in Guatemala in 1954. You know, there's many more examples when you see the secret services of the US, of Great Britain, of Chile, or of Spain, or of Italy, were involved in criminal activities. And that is not acceptable. I mean, that's not something very extreme to say. It's just, if you park your car in the wrong place, you get a ticket, okay? That's normal. That's how a system works. And the democracy must control its secret service. It's important. And when the Secret Service is deliberately allowed to carry out criminal activities, then that is not acceptable.
Can we consider Al-Qaeda as a database of stay-behind soldiers? Is it similar to the Gladio structure?
I mean, Al-Qaeda was formed in the 1980s by the CIA and Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan to fight the Soviets. And it is true that there were regular soldiers who fought the Soviets in the 1980s in Afghanistan, and that Al-Qaeda was sort of a second branch of, if you want, secret soldiers. But it is not the same like the Gladio network. The parallels are that the CIA was involved, yes, that is a parallel. That they were armed, yes, that was a parallel. But in this case, you did not have right-wing extremists, you had Muslim extremists. I mean, what we had in the 1980s is that Osama bin Laden had people in Afghanistan who were extreme Muslims. They would never want to live in a country with a Christian in the same country. You know, they would say, we don't want any Christians here. And we don't want any atheists here. They're not tolerant at all. They're very extremist Muslims. And they fought the Soviets because they thought, these are atheists. They should leave our country. We will kill them all. And today it's the same thing with the Americans and the British and the Canadians and the Germans in the Afghanistan war today. You know, many Afghans say, we don't want you here. You're all Christians. Go home. We don't want you. And what we had in the Al-Qaeda network in the 1980s was that Saudi Arabia exported a lot of their militant extremists to Afghanistan because they had very militant extremists in Saudi Arabia, and those were critical. I mean, Osama bin Laden himself came from Saudi Arabia, and they were critical about the U.S. influence in the oil region. They said, we don't want this influence here. This is sacred ground for the Muslims. Mecca and Medina in Saudi Arabia, these cities are holy cities. And in order to have these people who were angry out of the sight, they just sent them to Afghanistan. Later they sent them to Bosnia and then to Albania during the Yugoslavian conflict. So it's a different thing, you know, the terrorism today with the extreme Muslims and the terrorism during the Cold War with the extremist right wings. But obviously the question surfaces, you know, who is running the show? Who is manipulating terrorism? That's still today one of the big questions.
And have you studied the Kosovo Liberation Army and with the links with the CIA,
Yeah, I know something about the Kosovo Liberation Army. I mean, the interesting thing is that in March 1999, NATO bombs the Kosovo. Now that was illegal because NATO did not have a mandate from the UN Security Council. And if you don't have a mandate from the UN Security Council, you're not allowed to bomb anybody. It is illegal. The argument put forward at the time was, well, Milosevic is a very evil man, and he maybe was. And secondly, he's killing the people in Kosovo, especially the Albanians. And, you know, some of this was true. But still, you don't have the right to bomb a country. interestingly enough, the Kosovo Liberation Army was supported by the British and the Americans before the bombing. So you actually made the problem bigger. We have records from the Special Air Service, SAS. These are paramilitary of the British. And from the Green Berets, these are special forces of the US, that they were in the area and they trained the KLA and made them stronger. Okay? By training the KLA and making them stronger, you later increased the problem for Milosevic, because the KLA, together with other Albanians, started the fighting, intensified the fighting in Kosovo, and from the other side you had the Serbs from the secret forces and the official police forces and the military forces from Milosevic, and these just engaged in heavy fighting. Still today, they don't trust each other. One group is Muslim. The other group is Orthodox Christians. That's the Serbs, and that's the Albanians. And I just look at the conflict, and I see the Americans and the British. They at that time supported the Muslims and made them stronger. They increased the problem, and then they said, "Hey, there's a problem," and then they came with the NATO planes and bombed the Serbs as the air force of the Muslims. It's a strange thing, but it happened, and we need more investigation into the Kosovo conflict, because it seems that the problem was there, but it was intensified deliberately.
And I just have one more last question, and it's over.
And one more.
Regarding 9/11, do you think it could be a false flag operation?
It's a big question, It's the last question, but it's a very big question. It's a very delicate question, because 9/11 was presented by American President George Bush as a surprise attack. He said, Osama bin Laden is responsible. He told 19 Muslim terrorists, including Mohammed Atta, to attack the United States, and Bush and Cheney were surprised. Okay, that's the official conspiracy theory. It's also a conspiracy theory because in this case, 19 Muslims conspired to carry out the attack. Now, obviously, those who have followed the events know that there are news stories which say, no, that's not the right story. This is called the surprise theory. It's not true. The second story is completely different, and it says, Osama bin Laden attacked the United States, but Bush and Cheney, they're criminal. Okay? They saw the attack coming, and they sacrificed 3,000 people in order then to be able to carry out wars in Afghanistan and in Iraq, to secure oil and gas reserves, and to reduce civil liberties in the United States. That is a completely different story. And the third story says, no, it was not like that. That's also conspiracy theory, and it says, this terrorist attack had nothing to do with Osama bin Laden. These videos that we've seen from Osama bin Laden, they were fabricated, fake. The attacks were carried out by groups in the United States, CIA, Pentagon, Secret Services, criminal elements within these structures. They carried out the terrorist attacks against the United States themselves and sacrificed 3,000 people. It has to be said, that would be very extreme, if a country like the United States attacks its own people, kills 3,000, says it's somebody else, and then starts these wars. And what we really have as historians is that we look at the credibility of the Bush government and we say, is it the case that they have ever lied to us? And the answer is yes. In the case of the attack of Iraq, the claim was made there are weapons of mass destruction. This was a lie. Colin Powell said it in the Security Council. Weapons of mass destruction. He was foreign secretary at the time. And it was a lie. So there's not a lot of trust in the Bush administration. There's not a lot of trust in Bush and Cheney at all. We know they lied to us in the Iraq war. They furthermore said that Al-Qaeda is somehow linked to Saddam Hussein, and therefore Saddam Hussein has something to do with 9/11. Another lie. It's complete nonsense. It's not true. And I say that is the reason, because they've lied so many times, that some people say, and 9/11 as well is a lie. They lied to us there as well. And they point to the fact that we do have two Twin Towers, which were hit by a plane, and then the Twin Towers crash. Okay, that's what everybody has seen. But in the back, we have a third building, which is called World Trade Center number 7. And it's not being hit by the plane, and it crashes also on 9/11. So it's not 2, but it's 3 buildings which collapse on 9/11. When I first discussed this with American researchers, a very good researcher is David Ray Griffin. He's a professor who knows a lot about 9/11. You know, I was surprised myself. I mean, most people had never heard of it, that there are 3 buildings which collapsed. And that means that, yes, we must research more also on 9/11. It is very difficult because that is very, very delicate. I mean, we must research more on Gladio, we must research more on Kosovo, and we must research more on 9/11. And the idea why we must actually look at these things again is we must find out whether some of the violence that we are living in is manipulated, is politically manipulated. And if that is the case, it is not acceptable. And then we should say, we don't want this.
Thank you very much, Daniele, for this long interview.
How long did we talk? It was a very long interview.
Yes, 1 hour and a half. A lot of things.